Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica Hope from the Humane and Sustainable Food Lab here at Stanford, and we're very glad you've joined us this morning. Today's topic is moral preferences and the marketplace of ideas, presented by Josh Tasoff. I'm super curious about the marketplace of ideas concept, which is new to me, and I always love talking about moral philosophy, so this is going to be really fun. Today's talk is part of an ongoing seminar series sponsored by the Humane and Sustainable Food Lab. We highlight significant research aimed at hastening the end of factory farming. At the end of the talk, we'll have time for questions. Through the webinar interface, you can ask to speak aloud yourself if you want to have a direct conversation with Josh, or you can just put your questions in the chat or the Q&A and I can ask them for you. And now here is our lab's amazing leader, Professor Maya Mather.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So we're very lucky today to have Josh Tasoff, who's an associate professor at the Claremont Graduate University's Department of Economic Sciences. And Josh works a lot in behavioral econ and translates the skill set into some really interesting and rigorously designed studies on reducing meat consumption. I think maybe one of your first and very high profile ones was published in 2020, which was a very interesting study looking at an educational intervention at colleges and had a sort of unprecedented individual level objectively measured data. So I think these kinds of designs really set a standard for the field going forward. And we're super excited to hear about your new work as well. So please take it away, Josh.
Thank you, thank you. Let me see if let me do the share. I'll just do the full desktop. And now if I go, let's see. You're getting the full?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks so much. It's an honor and very flattering to be presenting at your lab. I'm really impressed with the output of this lab, and the research. It seems like there's so much. It's like, wow, I want to read all this. How do I keep up with this? I see like every year there's just so much research coming out. This is joint work with Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughan and Ming Pham. Ming is one of my former students. Emiliano, actually, I went to graduate school with, and Eva Vival, who I also actually went to graduate school with. This is actually the first project I started on animal welfare, economics of animal welfare, and it took a really long time. We could talk about that later. So let's jump in. Okay, so many of the most important changes in society have occurred because of shifts in norms and institutions. And these often begin with advocates presenting new ways of thinking that criticize the status quo and present an alternative path. Advocacy often fits the form that there's a harm perpetrated in the world that can be mitigated by a costly personal action. You could think of the civil rights movement. You could think of abolitionism and slavery. There are these important rhetorical pieces, such as the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. With women's suffrage, there was the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And the efficacy of this rhetoric depends on a few factors. So one, it depends on the audience's information preferences. Is the audience willing to take up the message, or do they want to avoid it? Okay. So intrinsic information preferences can cause selection into the message or selection away from the message. And this is an important factor, and this is going to be one of the key concepts we're going to study in this project. Second, moral costs. So the way we're thinking about this rhetoric, this advocacy, is that it imposes psychic incentives on the audience members for the morally implicated action. So these determine what, if any, behavior change may result. So for example, I mean, you take abolitionism, I mean, maybe they say, don't buy sugar because sugar's or don't buy cotton because those two products are produced in slave plantations, and that's a costly individual action that a person could take. In the context that we're going to talk about here, it's going to be about eating meat, right? And then there's also this third factor that also influences the efficacy of rhetoric. Rarely is it the case that these messages are just kind of directly sent to an audience in a vacuum. Usually there's this interplay between the advocacy of the social changers and then defenders of the status quo. So in the marketplace of ideas, defenders of the status quo could offer counter messages that combat advocates' messages. And people's intrinsic information preferences can lead them into, one of these messages or the other. And this is going to lead to rich interactions between people's moral preferences, their information preferences and their uptake, and then finally, ultimately, their behavior. The context we're looking at is going to be meat consumption and animal welfare. I think, so normally I say, okay, well, why do we care about this topic for this audience? I'll skip that. I think we're all, it's preaching to the choir. I think we're all on the same page here. But I think also just from an empirical standpoint, this is kind of my pitch to the economists who maybe might not otherwise care about animal welfare so much. It's a timely context to understand moral preferences and the interplay of advocacy and counter messages because it's a growing social movement that doesn't yet have buy-in from the public, right? If we talked about something that's like already like civil rights, like, okay, people in America, everybody already believes that. It's not really an interesting topic because in terms of persuading people, because everybody's already persuaded. This is one where there is a movement, but people have not yet been persuaded. And then second, the context is well suited for economic analysis because there's actually a very concrete, measurable action attached to the advocacy, which is what do you eat, right? Do you eat meat or not? And that's something that we could directly observe. Okay, so what do we do? So we're going to run a lab experiment in which subjects, and mostly college students, are going to watch videos and they're going to eat food items. Now, we're going to use the standard sort of economic paradigm where everything is real stakes, right? We're listing people's preferences, but there's always some chance that we're going to enforce those preferences where you're actually going to eat the food item, you're actually going to see the video. And then we're going to elicit, so as I said, we're going to elicit the demand for videos and food items. We're going to estimate people's information preferences. We're going to estimate what we're going to call a moral cost function induced by the videos to eating meat. So what is the costs imposed once you see this kind of advocacy video? And then we're going to use the empirical data that we elicit in this experiment to then do, as an economist, I would say structural counterfactual analysis, but to sort of make it a little bit more understandable, we're basically simulating counterfactuals. We're saying, well, what if now we have all this data about the consumers, the subjects in our experiment, and we could say, how would they behave in a different environment? You have to make some assumptions to get that to work, but fairly modest assumptions because we're going to elicit people's full demand curves. And so then we could put them in an environment where they're kind of in a market situation as represented by their own stated preferences. And we could say, in this environment where there is a marketplace of ideas, what's the optimal policy? How do we minimize meat subject to a budget constraint? And then we're going to do, the most, I think, interesting part is we're going to do what we call misspecification analysis. What if the policymaker misunderstands the environment that they're in ways that we think a real policymaker might misunderstand? And how much are they gonna mess up the policy? Okay. Okay, research questions. Let's dial into the research questions. So these kind of come into several buckets. The first bucket is information preferences. So the big question is, what are consumers' preferences for the messages? And the first question we're going to ask is, are people message seeking? Do they want to get this information? Or are they message avoiding? Are they going to try to avoid messages about, how animals are treated in factory farms? Then our second hypothesis, which is a little bit more specific, is we have this hypothesis that kind of comes out very naturally out of a very simple model, which is, do avoiders care more? Okay, so do avoiders of the animal advocacy message, are they the ones who are most affected by the message? So think about it this way. Suppose there's heterogeneity in the impact of the message on, this message is imposing these like psychic moral costs on people. And imagine that there's some heterogeneity in those costs. The people who have the highest costs, who are going to be the people who are going to reduce their meat consumption the most. But because those are high psychic costs, they're also the people who are going to want to avoid those costs the most, right? So there should be we would expect a correlation between these two things. So that's our do avoiders care more question. So we could test for that. And then there's another natural implication from a simple model, which is that we would expect selective search. So after you receive information about the animal advocacy, after you receive that animal advocacy message, does that then dial up demand for what we call the counter message, the message that defends the status quo? So we could simply test that. Well, I'll give you, I'll ruin the suspense. We actually don't find evidence for that. But we then dial into a more nuanced version of that question, and I'll show you that when we get to the results. Okay. Next bucket of hypotheses. What's the shape of consumers' induced moral costs from these messages? So does the rhetoric put a deontological like fixed cost on the implicated behavior? Or do citizens act more like utilitarians where they experience a constant psychic cost for each unit of the implicated behavior? So, for example, the meat that we're going to have in this experiment is going to be chicken nuggets, right? So if you eat one chicken nugget, does that, you just saw a video that talks about how meat's bad. You're kind of tempted to eat this chicken nugget. Let's say you go for it. That makes you feel some guilt. You have this psychic moral cost. How do you feel about the next chicken nugget? Well, I already broke the rule. I'll eat one more. It doesn't really matter at this point. That would be a fixed moral cost. A linear moral cost is, well, 2 nuggets is twice as bad as 1 nugget. Every unit of nugget has some harm. So what's the psychology for the consumer? Are they more in the former camp with the fixed cost, or they're more in the latter camp with a linear cost? And I think the default assumption for an economist is to usually to lean into the utilitarian. So, and it's also, okay, so why do we care about this? One, I think we just care about it because I think it's just kind of interesting to understand the consumer psychology about how these moral costs work. But also it's interesting from an economic standpoint because the different moral costs shift the demand curve in different ways. So if it's a linear moral cost, a quantity in the quantity, right? So let's call it a quantity cost. Then it just shifts the demand curve down like a standard per quantity tax. If, on the other hand, it's a fixed moral cost, it distorts the shape of the demand curve, depending on some ancillary assumptions. I won't go into the details in the talk today, but there's a little bit of analysis of that in the paper. So it could shift the demand curve in very different ways, which might have implications for policy. So this is kind of something that might be important. And then third, we're going to think about the marketplace of ideas for policy analysis. So suppose you have a policymaker who wishes to reduce meat consumption, who's asking the question, what is the optimal, by optimal, I mean meat minimizing policy. If a policymaker does not account for the marketplace of ideas, how much do they mismanage the policy, right? If they are very conventional and think I have a meat tax and that's the only thing I could do, how much are they going to screw it up? How much do they misunderstand also the impact of their misforecast the impact of their intervention? And then two, another misspecification analysis, what happens if they think everybody's a quantity cost person, when in fact there's some distribution where some are quantity costs, some are fixed costs? How much, again, do they mismanage the policy? Okay. Those are the questions. I could pause right here if there's any sort of big picture questions or. And then if anybody, I don't see any chats, but if anybody has any questions, they could sort of jump in. Feel free to interrupt. Okay, so let's jump into the experiment design. Okay, so we begin. So it's a lab experiment. Some subjects show up. They receive a $7 show-up fee. The experiments done at the Claremont colleges. We have 306 participants. Subjects were told to come to the Pomona College Experimental Lab hungry, so that that they might eat food items. Some of them might be unappetizing to them. And then we randomly assign people to 4 conditions. So a control condition, a factory farm condition. FF is going to stand for factory farm throughout. CM is going to stand for counter message, the counter message condition. And finally, this is a typo. It should say IC, incentive compatible condition. The IC condition is not for analysis. That's just to impose truth-telling incentives on the full sample. Economists are never allowed to lie in an experiment. So if we say something could happen, it actually has to be true. So that's kind of, the IC group is there to sort of incentivize, to provide real stakes. But because people are going to self-select into their conditions, we don't want to analyze that because it has a selection effect. So that 10% of data gets dumped. Okay, so these are the 3 groups. And then what we do is we elicit people's moral values regarding, animal welfare, eating meat, just kind of a survey. Then we elicit people's food preferences using the Becker-DeGroot-Marshak procedure, using 4 different food items, which I'll show in a moment. And then we elicit their preferences to watch 2 different videos, also using the BDM. So, okay, just a pause here. Should I explain the BDM? Is this like a understood method, or should I go into the details of this?
Maybe you go into the details a little bit.
Okay, great. Okay, so the BDM is, so this is I mean, there's probably 1,000 econ papers, many hundreds at least, that use this method. It's the Becker-DeGroot-Marshak procedure, standard in econ, and it's a way to provide real stakes to elicit people's valuations. And the way it works is that subjects state their willingness to pay for a good. The experimenter then randomizes the price. If the price is below the stated willingness to pay, they buy the good at the price. If the price is above the willingness to pay, they don't buy the good. And this provides incentives for truthfully stating one's willingness to pay. Now, so when I say it like that, I think it's a little bit confusing to think about. But let me give you an analogy of what the logic of what's actually going on. Imagine you have a friend who's going to the store, they're going to Target or whatever, and you wanted to buy an air fryer, some item, and they're like, "Hey, buddy, can you buy me an air fryer? Here's some money. Here's $200." And they say, "Sure. What's the most you want me to spend on the air fryer?" And they're using your money, by the way. They're using your money. Do you have any incentive to lie to them what your true valuation is, right? You'll say, if you say your true valuation is $100 and you say a number below that, well, then they might not buy the air fryer when you actually want them to buy the air fryer, right? Say you state a number above 100. Well, then they might actually buy the air fryer when it's more expensive than how much you actually value it. So your incentive is to tell them the truth. You have no reason to lie to your friend. Buy the air fryer when it's $100 or less, right? That's basically the logic of the BDM. You don't know the price at the store, right? So you're kind of giving some information. Buy it only if the price is sufficiently low. That's exactly how the BDM works. And the cool thing about this is you can also reverse it. So that's how the way I described it is for goods. You could do the same thing for bads. You could say, how much do I have to pay you to accept this, like to eat like a bad, like a food that you don't want to eat, like a chili pepper or something like that. And that elicits how much people dislike the good or the bad, I should say. Okay, so here are the food items that we do. So we were going to have meat items and we have veg items. The veg items are kind of meant to be control comparisons to the meat items. And we got chicken nuggets and Spam cubes. And then for the veg, we got veg nuggets and what we called veg Spam, but it's this product called Nuttolene, which is it's made from peanuts. It's actually not that bad, but it is kind of weird, and it doesn't look very appetizing, does it? And so originally I won't go into the details here, but originally we wanted one item that was tasty and one item that was aversive because we had some hypotheses about asymmetry between goods and bads. In the end, we couldn't really test this hypothesis because we basically got censoring issues. We got floor issues. People really didn't like the Spam. And so many people went to the lowest valuation that we couldn't like analyze the data in the way we wanted to. So it happens. So that this is actually the reason why the paper's so old. We had to figure out, we spent a lot of time thinking like, okay, now what do we do? Like, how do we analyze the data? So, but anyway, okay. So for each of these items, we have people elicit their demand for 1 unit and 3 units of the item. The reason why we have them we do that is by eliciting demand for multiple units, we can identify whether subjects have fixed moral costs or linear moral costs. So we kind of need that variation to see the moral costs. Okay, let me get back. Oh, okay, yeah. Now let me go talk about the videos. Okay, there's 2 videos. There's that FF video, the factory farm video, which is the animal advocacy video. It's a real video that is used by advocates or was used by advocates called Farm to Fridge. I think you can see it on YouTube. It's a very powerful video. I found it very powerful. But it's very graphic and it's not, I don't think it's used by advocates anymore because it's so graphic. But you could find it on the internet. Then for the counter message video, we use this kind of anodyne family farm promotional video. It kind of shows animals on this family farm in, allegedly like happy conditions and kind of with the advocacy like, oh, look, it's not so bad. Like, this is pretty nice. Okay. So we elicit people's valuations for the food items, then the videos. Then we randomly assign them to the video. So the incentive compatible group, they get what they actually, paid for, depending on their choices and chance. People don't know what condition they're in, so these incentives apply to everyone. There's some chance that your choices could count. That's why the IC group exists. Okay, so for the control group, they don't get any video. They're never going to get any video. The FF group, they get the FF video. The counter message group, they get the FF video as well. Then we re-elicit people's preferences for the video. This is to test whether seeing the FF video increases the demand for the counter message. That's why we would put it there. The control group never sees anything, then does not see a video. The FF group then does not see a video. And the counter message group then sees the counter message video. So just to kind of summarize, control group never sees a video. FF group sees video, then it's not actually a blank screen, it's actually a screensaver, but basically contentless image. Then the counter message group gets the FF video, then followed by the CM video. Okay, so that's kind of the design. That's the variation. Um, and then we re-elicit people's food preferences at the end. So we have like this post and pre valuation of every food item. We have moral values, post and pre, and we have the video evaluation kind of post and pre. Okay. And then we do like background survey, and then we assign the food items at the very end. Any questions about the design?
Could you talk just a minute about the moral value elicitation? Like, what did you ask them? Like, are you vegetarian, or did you ask them how did you feel about meat? Sorry, I didn't catch what you asked.
Yeah, I didn't go. I'm not going to show the results for it, so that's why I didn't go into it. I mean, there's some in the paper. We were hoping to emphasize it more, but it kind of ended up being a little bit too noisy to really do much with. But the moral value elicitation, it was questions like it was attitudinal questions. I can't remember how many questions we had. It was like attitudinal questions about like what people think about animal farming, whether people have negative views towards vegetarianism, whether you need to eat meat to have adequate protein. It's kind of a combination of all these different things.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so then we look at these, let's go into the results. Okay, so information avoidance. So 78% of subjects are going to pay money to not watch that factory farm video, which makes sense because it's pretty graphic, right? It's maybe not so surprising. This is not something that's fun to watch. On the other hand, people, there's think of all the Academy Award winners. A lot of those are not, you don't really want to watch those, initially. But then once you watch them, like, wow, that was a good movie, and you start recommending them to your friends, right? So, I mean, there's curiosity elements. There's elements of bettering yourself. It's not entirely obvious that people would, avoid this, but we have very high avoidance. Contrast that to the avoidance of the counter message, which is 37%. People don't really want to watch that so much, but it's not nearly as extreme as with the factory farm video. Then we also just test whether avoidance is correlated with people's elicited meat demand. And we don't, it's kind of a natural implication that they should be related, but we don't see any evidence for that. Okay, so let's jump into these regression tables. So here, these tables show the effect of the videos, which are randomly assigned, on meat demand, on people's valuation of the meat items, using relative to the non-meat items, as controls. So columns 1 through 3 are the outcome is dichotomous. It's whether you increase your valuation of the food item or whether you or stayed the same. And so really, I mean, the real variable of interest is the opposite of this, the -1, this times the logical. You get what I'm trying to say? It's the thing is we want to keep a negative coefficient on this, so that's why we did it that way instead of the other direction. And then columns 4 through 6 are the literal change in willingness to pay. We're using pre-willingness to pay as a control, actually a polynomial expansion of pre-willingness to pay as a control. And then the main variable of coefficient of interest is the condition interacted whether the item is a meat item. And what we find, and so we're breaking this up. So because we get a lot of censoring in the spam, we kind of disaggregate by nugget, spam, and then combined, just to show kind of the robustness of these results. But let's just sort of jump to columns 3 and 6 because that's kind of the full data set. And what we find is The factory farm condition makes you much more likely to reduce your meat consumption. These are linear probability models. So you can interpret this as 27.5 percentage points more likely to reduce your meat consumption, 18.2 percentage points more likely to reduce your meat consumption in the counter message group. We could test whether those coefficients are equal to each other. The p-value here, not quite significant, 0.12. But in column 6, where we just have the raw delta in people's willingness to pay in dollars. So it's $2.67 for the FF group, $1.48 for the CM group, and it's significant. The difference between those two coefficients is significant at the p equals 0.003 level. So the takeaway here is the information is reducing people's valuations. And what I like about, I mean, this is just kind of showing that the experiment's doing what we intended it to do. The factory farm video lowers people's valuations a lot. The counter message attenuates that effect. It undoes some of the effect of the FF message. But just to remind you, everybody in the CM condition has also seen the FF video, right? So it's whenever you see CM, it's FF plus CM.
Josh, quick question on the linear probability model. So the outcome here is choosing meat at all. We're not looking at the number of nuggets or Spam chunks, right?
Right, exactly. I'm going to do that. That's the next table. This is kind of just, okay, did it work? Question, yeah. The next, two tables, sorry, not this one. Okay, so this one we're going to look at whether avoiders care more. And the selective search, like basically the associations between these information preferences and the treatment effect. So the avoiders care more. So what we're doing here is we're interacting whether you saw the FF video with, whether the item is meat, and then it's this triple interaction here on the third row with your valuation, your initial valuation of the FF video. So is it the case that people who have low initial valuations of the FF video also have bigger treatment effects, which means more negative treatment effects? And basically all the coefficients here are not significant. So we just don't see any evidence of that, at least in our sample here. Maybe our measures are too noisy, but I mean, whatever. We don't have any evidence that avoiders care more. It seems there's no association one way or another. Now, as far as selective search goes, what we did is we looked at, now this isn't shown in this table here, I'm just going to tell you a simple test that we did. After watching the FF video, does your demand for the CM video go up? And we just tested that, and we don't find any evidence of that. Demand for the CM video does not go up, which was a little bit disappointing to us because we kind of thought that would happen. But then if you look, going back to the last table, if you look, like how many people are actually affected by these videos? Well, it's kind of like, 27 percentage points are affected. A lot of people are unaffected by the video. So maybe it's just too big of an ask to say that like these 75% of people, these 3/4 of people who are not affected by the video are going to now increase their demand to undo an effect that never affected them, an effect that's zero on them. Why would they do that? Okay. So our more nuanced look at selective search is to say, are the people who are most affected by the by the FF video those who also have higher demand for the CM video, or is there association between those things? So the triple interaction here is you saw the FF video, it's a meat item, of course, and it's your valuation, your second elicitation valuation for the counter message. And higher valuation should lead to bigger treatment effects, which means more negative coefficient, higher magnitude negative coefficient. And that's what we find, at least in the full sample. So we do see this evidence for some selective search. If we then look at the nugget sample, those coefficients are somewhat a little bit smaller, and the standard errors are bigger because we're only using like half of our data here. So, there's some evidence here. It wasn't our original hypothesis. If your prior was that, yeah, the selective search thing, I kind of believe that. Maybe you find this, fairly convincing evidence. If you had a skeptical prior and thought, I don't believe that hypothesis, maybe this isn't really enough to sort of to move you to find this convincing. I mean, for me, I think, this is, it's some evidence. It's not, as decisive as I would have liked, but it does seem like there's some association between, people who have bigger treatment effects, people who are more influenced by the factory farm video, are also people who then increase their demand, or I shouldn't say increase, but who have higher demand for the counter message to undo the effect of the factory farm video, as if to undo the effect of the factory farm video. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to get at the moral cost function. So are people these fixed cost people, or are they quantity costs? So we're going to estimate here, suppose that everybody has the same moral cost function. We're going to sort of impose sort of this average aggregate moral cost function on this kind of representative person, and we're going to estimate that. We could go straight to columns 3 and 6. So rows 1 and 2, those coefficients are the fixed costs, and rows 3 and 4 are the linear costs. And so in the full sample, well, we have, we see, very strong evidence for fixed costs. We see pretty strong evidence, at least in the counter message group, of linear costs. Maybe not significant here for the FF group. If we look at the nugget only sample, I mean, I can't really get those linear costs to go away. Can't get those stars to go away. So, I think this is pretty strong evidence that there's some there's both fixed costs and linear costs in the sample. Seems like there's evidence for both. It's not like everybody is fixed costs or everybody's linear costs. Seems like there's some mix of those two. We could also look at individual level analysis. So what we could do is we could take each individual and say, assign them to one of 3 different types. We could say, does your data fit best as no moral costs? Does it fit best as a fixed moral costs? Or does it fit best as a linear moral cost? And by fit best, I mean using, minimizing the squared error of your responses. How does your data does it match one of which bucket does it match the best of these 3 buckets? So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we do this, this is visualized in this figure here. So in the control condition, we do that as well. Unfortunately, only 59% of people are nuns in the control condition. I mean, we kind of want 100% of people in the control condition to not have moral costs. But people are fluctuating. Their post valuations might be different than their pre valuations, maybe just because they change their mind, or they get more hungry over the course of their experiment, or less hungry over the course of the experiment. And that fluctuation in their preferences is just kind of causes them to get assigned to these different buckets by chance. So some of them end up in the fixed, some of them end up in the quantity. But then if we compare those numbers to the fixed, okay, also I should mention, why is there a double number? We do some bounding analysis under 2 different sets of assumptions. So under one set of assumption, 14% fit as fixed. Under a different assumption, 17%. So we say it's like in this range. In the FF condition, we see, it compared to the control, it goes from 14 to 17%, to 22 to 37%, right? So there's kind of this big increase in the number of people who seem to be best explained as fixed cost individuals. And then likewise for the quantity cost, it goes from something like 24 to 27% of this kind of like misfiring, misassignment in the control to 36 to 52%. So we get a lot more people who sort of behave as if they kind of fit these archetypal moral cost types. Okay, so that's the analysis on the individual cost. I'm going to just check on the time. Should probably rush to the end. Okay, let's get to the policy analysis. I want to save some time for questions. So now we're going to assume we're going to look at the policy analysis. We're going to imagine there's this policymaker. The policymaker's objective is to minimize meat consumption in this like simulated little world. And they have access to 3 policy levers. Policymaker could tax meat. The policymaker could subsidize the FF video, and the policymaker could tax the counter message video. And in our analysis, we're going to take this information policy straightforwardly as a subsidy on viewing or not viewing the messages. But you could think of these policies as regulations that implicitly tax or subsidize messages. Like, we live in a free country, we have freedom of speech. You don't really think of the government as like taxing information, right? This is like bizarre. It sounds like the power to tax is the power to destroy. Seems like it violates the First Amendment. But there are examples already in our society where there are policies that make it harder for certain kinds of information to go from, advocates to or counter advocates to the public. So, for example, there's prohibitions on smoking advertisements. You can't do it on TV. You can't advertise smoking to kids. There's prohibitions on false or deceptive advertising. There's also, so these are things that would make it more costly for the audience to get the message from these firms, from these agents. And there's also ways to make it easier for the public to get certain messages. The government could do PSA, public service announcements. They could do public health campaigns where they actively spend money to promote certain messages. So you could think of, this is kind of more the realistic manifestation of those kinds of policies, but just keep it kind of simple. We're going to model it as just kind of like these direct pecuniary incentives to make it more accessible or less accessible to get these kind of pieces of information. Now, to make this also an interesting problem, all of these taxes are actually implemented as subsidies for abatement. Because the optimization problem here for the policymaker is that they have a budget constraint. They want to minimize meat consumption subject to the budget constraint. And a subsidy uses up budget. A tax adds to the budget. So if you have an actual literal tax here, it's not a well-defined problem. You just want to maximize the tax. It's not an interesting problem, right? It doesn't use up your budget. So we want to put all these policies on the same footing. They're all subsidies. But they implicitly a subsidy for abatement is implicitly the same thing as a tax. It affects the budget differently, but should affect behavior in the same way. Okay, so now let's jump to the results. So there's some structural assumptions here, but fairly modest. And this is the aggregate demand by message regime. Okay, so this is a demand curve. On the horizontal, we got meat consumption. On the vertical, we got the price of meat. The light blue curve is meat demands under the regime of no information. The dashed red curve is if everybody watches the factory farm video. You can see it shifts the demand curve way down, right? So this is this information is really powerful. If they see the counter message, it attenuates that effect somewhat, right? The counter message is this dashed green curve. So it kind of shifts that demand back up a little bit from the factory farm video. That counter message video is undoing some of the fact of the factory farm video. And then finally, this black curve is the question, what happens when people self-select into the message, right? Because we know people's message preferences. We know how much they dislike the factory farm video and how much they dislike the counter message. And so we can see what messages they actually select into. And as you can see, the curve is actually pretty close to the no information curve. People don't want to see these messages. So just having, this marketplace of ideas where you throw out these messages, especially when they're disturbing, and they impose these kind of psychic costs on people, they don't really want to consume them, right? So you're pretty close to a no information regime. Okay, now we're going to look at aggregate demands under some policies. So these are kind of demand curves, but not exactly. The vertical has changed. The vertical, rather than being the price, it's going to be the tax on meat. The baseline price is 15 cents because it's roughly 15 cents to buy a chicken nugget if you buy them in bulk. So really, these are demand curves shifted by 15 cents. So you could basically think of these as demand curves. And the black curve here is the no information tax, no subsidy curve. It's the exact same curve from the previous slide here that's black, except shifted by 15 cents. It's basically the same thing. That's kind of our default no policy curve, except for the tax on meat, which is the vertical, axis. Okay, now we're going to ask the question in the dashed gold. What happens if we impose a $5 subsidy on the FF video? We're paying people $5 to watch the FF video. What happens? So some people are going to take up that message, and you see the demand curve shifts down, right? What happens now? The dashed orange is we say what happens if we tax the counter message by $5? And it has almost no effect. That dashed orange curve is right on top of the black curve. Doesn't really seem to do anything because I guess people aren't really watching the counter message that much anyway. Or the factory farm video without incentives to do so. Now the lavender curve is when we have both of these policies simultaneously. And what I think the typical thing to expect is that lavender curve should be the lowest demand curve because you're incentivizing people to watch the factory farm video and you're disincentivizing people to watch the counter message. So you're kind of funneling people into this FF message, keeping them away from counter message, right? But actually it backfires. It's higher than the dashed gold curve this was a surprise to us. And basically what's going on here is we assume that people are forward looking. We assume that people know in our little simulation here, people know the impact of these different videos are going to be on their preferences here. Basically the CM video acted as like a safety valve or imagine there's some people who want to be informed, they're willing to watch the FF video, but only if they can undo some of the effect by also watching the CM video. But if they can't watch the CM video, they don't want any information. And so we get this backfire effect by basically effectively excluding people from watching the CM video. They go only to they rather than getting the FF video, they just get no information at all. And so we get this like backfiring effect of taxing the CM video. And this explains it, but I don't have any time to go into it. Okay, let me just rush through the optimal policy because I want to save time for questions. I should probably end right now, but let's see. Okay, here's the optimal policy. Let me just explain what this is. It's not so the horizontal in panel A, the horizontal is total expenditures, the budget of your policymaker. The vertical shows the optimal policy vector as a function of that budget. As you could see, the light blue is the CM tax. Because it backfires, it's optimal to keep that at 0. It's not an effective policy at all. So people use some combination of the FF subsidy and the meat tax. Panel B shows how this affects meat demand. So as a function of budget. So as you under the optimal policy. So as you increase the budget of the policymaker, they're using this policy and it reduces meat demand. Okay, interesting. Artificial, it's all kind of fake in this little world. But I think the interesting thing is this misspecification analysis. What happens if the policymaker gets it wrong? So here we're going to say, what happens if they don't realize that they have information policy and they don't realize that there's this marketplace of ideas where there's advocates who are throwing out these advocacy messages and there's there's defenders of the status quo who are throwing out these defense messages. How much do they get it wrong? And let me just jump to panel B because that shows how much they get it wrong. The dark blue is the effect of the optimal policy. The dashed green is the effect of the suboptimal policy. The dashed red is what they think is the effect of their suboptimal policy. So that dashed red, the fact it's so high, is saying that they're pessimistic. They don't realize how effective their policy is. But the thing is, once they start taxing meat, it makes meat less valuable, which causes people to then take up more of the FF message. And so they don't realize that. They don't take that into consideration. And then second, the actual policy itself is less effective because they're not using the optimal message. And then I don't have time. Let me just jump to questions. I'd rather do questions. C and D is just showing how big these effects are. They're kind of, this is a simulation. It's kind of a proof of concept. But it's basically, the effects could be relatively large depending on what parameters you set for this simulation. Now we do the same thing for what happens if the policymaker thinks everybody is a quantity cost, like a utilitarian, and not a fixed cost. And it couldn't matter because, we did some pencil and paper examples, and they shifts the demand curves in different ways. Turns out it doesn't matter at all. The optimal policy and if you look at panel B, the optimal policy and the suboptimal policy are literally, you can't see them because they're literally on top of each other. They have no effect on the optimal, what the outcome really. So, okay, just to wrap up. Oh my God, okay, talked way too much. Okay, so we see evidence of message avoidance. We see selective search, some evidence for selective search that people with bigger treatment effects have higher demand to undo those treatment effects. But we don't see evidence for avoiders caring more. We see evidence for both linear moral costs and fixed moral costs. We find that taxing the counter message can backfire. We find that neglecting the marketplace of ideas for a policymaker could lead to suboptimal policy in meaningful ways. However, neglecting moral fixed costs seems to have no effect in our context. Okay, done. I'm done talking. Other people talk now.
That was great. That's a lot to chew on. A very, very interesting work.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I can start with one. I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of whether these cost trade-offs would change if people didn't know they're in this setting where they're kind of being tested with these videos. Like, I'm kind of wondering about social desirability here. Like, I mean, it's hard to construct a different design that would avoid that. Like, you have so much ability to kind of look at these very interesting cost curves, but I guess it does come at the price of subjects knowing that they're in this setting where you're interested in their meat consumptions. Yeah, any thoughts on that or how you might do that going forward?
Yeah, a few responses. So, I mean, the standard econ response for social desirability is, that's why we want real stakes. So, I mean, maybe people are doing it to express something to the researcher or to confirm the hypothesis or something like that. I think we did have a free response where I can't remember if we had a free response where we asked them, what do you think the hypothesis is? I'm not sure. I could go back and check. I do that in a lot of my experiments. I might be mixing it up. But we could potentially go back and check and see what people think the hypothesis of the experiment is. But also we have real stakes. So people are giving up money for that social desirability bias. Also, it's kind of like, well, isn't the social desirability bias the treatment effect? I mean, that's like, we're trying to persuade people. If it's the true that people want to please the persuader, that's maybe part of what a treatment effect is when you send a message, an advocacy message. So, is it a problem, or is that actually what the message is part of what, advocacy is? I don't know, yeah. But
Yeah,
so it might be a feature instead of a bug, but
yeah, no, I see your point. Yeah, it's fair. Yeah, I guess one setting in the real world that's maybe has somewhat less of that sort of social context is something like you see the video on Facebook, and then you're kind of going to the grocery store and you're really not being quote unquote monitored by anyone who is associated with the message. And so maybe there's a little bit more kind of anonymity there, but I see your point for sure.
yeah, just one thing. Yeah, as far we didn't we're not powered to look at long-term effects. Like this was something we spent a lot of time talking about. And I was a strong advocate. Like, nah, don't do it. We won't be powered. There's no point. Um, which maybe is too pessimistic, but um, one we did get, this is just anecdotal evidence, but we got one person who participated in the experiment who emailed us like a year or 2 years later saying that ever since she saw the video, she couldn't she couldn't eat meat, or every time she ate meat, she thought about the video.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, would you consider that an adverse effect of the experiment so that I can report it? Should I be reporting this to the IRB? I reported it to the IRB actually, and the IRB was like, "Wait, isn't that the point of your experiment?" I'm like, "Yeah, it is the point of the experiment." But it was aversive. It was I was like, "Do you want this?" I asked her like, "Is this like a bad outcome for you? Did you want this to happen?" And I kind of got the feeling like, oh, maybe she didn't like the fact that it happened.
Hmm. That's intriguing. Hmm.
I'm going to say thank you and end the recording right now, but don't go away. I just want to give people occasionally in our field, people want to ask questions without having it recorded. So thank you very much.